This episode is brought to you by Andrea, Sean, and Paul, this week's newest patrons. Hey guys, we talk a lot around here about buying sailboats, and the process can be a little bit scary sometimes. The last thing you want to end up doing is wasting any of your hard-earned dollars. And the whole idea can be really confusing sometimes. We're going to cover the 5 steps of buying a sailboat and hopefully make things a little bit easier and get you over some of the bigger hurdles involved so that we can get you out there sailing a little bit sooner and safer and hopefully with the most bang for your sailboat buck. This week on Everything You Need to Know, how to buy a sailboat. The first step in the buying a boat process is, of course, to narrow down the right kind of boat based on what you actually plan to do. You have to ask yourself, where am I going to be sailing this thing? What's the plan? What's the goal? You might be on some inland lakes, for example, and you're just going to use it as sort of a floating cottage, a swim platform for the kids, and a club racer. And it's never going to need to be out at sea in the middle of the ocean in a gale. So you might be best suited with something like a racer cruiser, like this C&C 35. This boat is a staple on the club racing scene, and you'll usually find them every Thursday night somewhere in the top 5 in whatever race that you're observing. But don't let its age fool you. This might be an 80s boat, but the interior is totally livable for a week or two if you want to take the family on a little boat trip. And you can have one of these for about 30 grand in pretty good shape. And it's a C&C, so you know it'll be well thought out and fairly well put together. Or if you're not inland lake, maybe you're on the coast and you need a boat that's going to suit you if you plan to jump out into the ocean whenever the need arises. You won't be living aboard necessarily full time, but the boat will need to stand up to some ocean-going fun as well as being comfortable enough to actually spend some time on it. For that, you might look at this Island Packet 31 for 50 grand. And if you know anything about sailboats, you know Island Packet. You've heard of these guys. They're heavy, they're solid boats, and they're built to be out in the ocean with the best of them. And the thick hull and the well laid out deck keeps you safe, even when the weather turns. Inside an Island Packet, of course, everybody always says the same thing, and I've seen this firsthand many times. They always say it looks much bigger, like a much bigger boat when you get in there. A 31 feels more like a 36. And the craftsmanship and attention to detail on these boats is one of the reasons they command the high prices that they do. And on top of that, they hold their resale value. Now, Island Packets also tend to be fairly simple to own and operate, and they're easy to sail sort of short-handed. And the key to it all is you don't need a 45-footer to be comfortable. Island Packet gives you all that comfort and safety that you need in a smaller package, so you can still single-hand it, and you can dock it by yourself if you need to. And then, of course, being a smaller boat, the cost of ownership tends to be a little bit lower. Or let's say maybe you have a little bit loftier goals. You're not a club racer and you're going to do more than just the East Coast. Maybe you want to go gung-ho around the Florida Keys and top that off with maybe a yearly escape to the Bahamas for a few months. And you know you won't be doing any ocean passages. You're not going all that far. And you'll just be living on the boat basically in a tropical paradise, making short island hops here and there. A great boat for that might be this one. It's a Beneteau 373. And when you start island hopping and spending most of your time simply living off the boat and snorkeling off the stern, loading groceries in from the dinghy, and your biggest passage is probably just the 80 miles from Bimini to Nassau, everything else is sort of a day hop, a few things become abundantly clear. You don't need an Island Packet to do this particular job safely, nor do you ever intend to cross the ocean. So what you need for this type of sailing is sort of a sugar scoop with a walk-through transom to make your life that much easier on your day-to-day living. You need a good-sized bedroom, preferably an aft cabin, with a nice good-sized saloon and a good-sized cockpit to hang out in. You also need the ease-of-use quality of life things when it's time to pull the anchor and head to the next tropical paradise. Things like dinghy davits to hold the rib and make that easier to deal with, and an in-mast furling so that you can just pop the main out and get underway much quicker. And these production-style boats, while lighter and never fully intended to make any real passages, they give you all that, and they're usually the most bang for your sailboat buck if those are your plans. Okay, but what if you do need to cross an ocean? What if that's your goal? You're going to go through the Caribbean and then up to the Med, and you want something that can be out at sea for weeks on end. Well, check out this. It's a Halberg Razzie 42-foot ketch. These guys are known to build boats for one purpose: ocean sailing. Halberg Razzie boats can be found anywhere in the world, and it's thanks to their overbuilt basically everything. The hulls are super thick solid glass, and you get things like a hard dodger and a center cockpit on this one to keep you dry and safe in whatever the worst the weather has to offer you in the ocean. You also get an overbuilt rig. You get high-end overbuilt Harken blocks and high-end overbuilt lines. All the sailing gear is just overbuilt all the time. And you get huge accommodations for things like anchors and chain and rode, because they know you're going to be out there anchoring in really crazy places. And they give you a big sail plan to make sure the boat's fast enough and you can shorten your crossing and run from bad weather if you need to. And don't think all this tough ocean going craziness is going to cramp your style, because on the inside, they're specifically laid out for comfort and safety at sea. Halberg Razzies always fetch a good price, and for a lot of good reasons, but it also means you won't lose much when it's time to sell it either. Boats will obviously never be a good investment, but with a name like this and a boat like this, you're probably not going to go broke selling it 5 years after you bought it. This tank has an almost full keel with a skeg hung rudder, as it should be for what it's designed to do, and a solid 25,000 pounds to throw around when things get crazy. But it does it all without being an unbearable 60-foot monster. This is still a 42-foot boat, so if you have to single-hand it or it's just a couple on board, it's actually fairly easy to live with. Now, once you've figured out what you're going to be using for a boat and you've sort of narrowed that part down, you'll know what's important to you, and maybe that's the big keel, or maybe it's the aft cabin with the walk-around queen bed, or maybe it's just something fast. Maybe that suits you best. Now we can narrow down the search even further by looking at price, of course. And everyone has a budget, and I promise you, every budget, there is a boat for you. The last factor we're going to use to sort of narrow down our search, once we know what we want and we know what we're willing to spend, is location. You don't want to, some people do fly around to look at boats from all over the world. You don't want to end up that way, because it's going to slow down the process and it's going to make things more difficult. Try to find something that's sort of within driving distance. That way you can look at 5 or 6 different examples and look at all the other boats around it as well. Now it's time for step 2. We're actually going to start looking at some boats. Now, let's come up with a scenario that might be you and it might not be you. Let's say we live in North or South Carolina. We want to spend 80 to 100 grand. And our goal isn't to cross oceans, it's just to do the Caribbean. But we're not super comfortable yet, so we want to get something that we're probably just going to do the East Coast, Florida Keys, maybe the Bahamas, a couple years from now, sort of Caribbean stuff. And it'll just be 2 people on board. And we want safety and comfort, but we never want to cross an ocean, so we're just going to cross off those boats. Let's start looking. In Wilmington, here's a prime example of a boat you will see all over the typical Caribbean cruising circuit. They're everywhere. In every anchorage there's at least one. This is a 2007 Beneteau 343, and the party piece for this particular one is it only has 280 hours on the diesel, and we're going to talk more about why that's important a little bit later. Now, while it's small, this boat is great for our plan to tackle everything from, the Carolinas, learning the boat, sailing it down to Florida, learning it a bit more, hopping across, and eventually ending up in Grenada. And it's good at those things for a few reasons. First, we're going to appreciate the shallower draft. This thing is just less than 5 feet, so we're not going to be holding our breath every time we go anywhere near Florida or the Bahamas, and that's a big plus. Next, we get a sugar scoop with a walk-through transom. So when we're anchored out, which we will be a lot, and we're going for groceries or water or fuel, and we're unloading from the dinghy, it's going to be a lot easier to sort of have that platform on the back. And this boat also gives us a lot of space inside for being just a 34-footer. You'd expect that from a Beneteau. It would be nice to have more space inside, but they're asking $78,000. This is below budget for us. And that's good, and that'll save us some cash to add solar and maybe a big anchor, as well as some other bells and whistles, anything we'd like. We have extra money if we buy this thing. And remember, this is just our example boat. Step 3 in our process is going to be to go see the boat and actually getting a feel physically for what it would be like to be on it, to sleep in it, to wake up in it, to cook breakfast, to live in this thing. And it's important to go see a bunch of boats at this sort of price point to get a better feel for what's out there, get a better feel for what will work. Don't just get sold on a 343. Experience is everything at this stage, and the more boats you can get on, the more intelligent you'll be in making these decisions. Before we go see this particular 343, we need to know what they're actually worth. Where's this price in sort of the range of the market? And we want to study the ad as much as possible. What did the broker or the owner tell us? What did they give us so that we can come fully armed with a list of questions and then things we want to inspect? I'm going to use Yacht World for some of my research here, but there's other sites like Boat Trader or Sailboat Listing, and they're fine too. Lady K Sailing is brought to you by patrons, people who give a couple of bucks an episode to really make these videos possible. And I'd like to give a big shout out to the existing patrons that have gotten us this far. If you'd like to help out the channel, please consider becoming a patron. So a quick search on Yacht World reveals a bunch of 343s, and the going price for sort of a non-chartered version, it seems to be about 80 to 95 grand. So the $78,000 asking price on ours seems kind of low, especially considering that it has almost no engine hours. I think they said 268. A lower price on an ad where the ad doesn't blatantly say that something's wrong is usually a good thing. The last thing you want to do is fall in love with a boat that has an owner that thinks the boat is worth way more than it actually is. This one actually seems pretty good. Our next task in the research phase is to find out what people tend to say about this model. We're looking for common problems, and a quick Google search of Beneteau 343 problems nets me a bunch of results. And here, I'm going to probably read them all before I go see this boat. Of course, grain of salt with some of them, because there are millions of armchair sailors out there that are just looking to ruin your day. Now, many of the comments on this boat seem to highlight that it's not meant for ocean crossings, and we knew that coming in. That wasn't our goal, and it was never the plan. Another useful comment I see is that the water and fuel tankage is a bit small, and that's totally true on this boat. This particular boat only holds 20 gallons on board of diesel, which is about $70 worth of diesel, and it holds 67 gallons of drinking water. Not a lot, but it's just a 34-footer, and our budget is what it is, so we may have to adapt to the tankage shortage here. And again, this model is all over the Caribbean already, so we're probably not reinventing the wheel. Adding another 60 gallons of diesel on deck in diesel cans and a portable water maker, as well as maybe some water cans, will solve the problem quite nicely and on the cheap. And we do have that nice sugar scoop on the back, so loading all that stuff onto the boat from the dinghy won't be too bad. Also of note, water and diesel are fairly widely available throughout the Caribbean on the regular beaten path cruising circuit. It's not like we're not going to be able to find it like we're in the out islands of Vietnam or something. Before you go see any boat, there's one more thing I want you to be armed with, and I call it the holy trinity of looking at a boat and figuring out how much you're willing to offer on that boat. This, of course, assumes the boat isn't a complete wreck with like soft decks and a broken mast or rusted chain plates. The three things that matter the most cost-wise are going to be the sails, the engine, and the standing rigging. Each of these could easily be over 10 grand after you buy the boat, and they need to be a primary concern. Of course, you'll be getting a survey, but there are some things that you can do to inspect these things before you pay to have a professional come in. And yes, as the buyer, you'll be paying for that survey. Some boats come with one, but they will be a bit older surveys, and the owner may claim that they fixed everything on the survey, and you have no way to know, and your insurance company is not going to take their word for it. So let's talk about those three things. For the sails, you want to roll them out, put them up, get them exposed all the way, and you want to inspect them and look at them as if you were inspecting a $10,000 leather jacket that you were interested in buying. How's the stitching? Is it frayed or sun damaged? How's the Dacron? Are there any patches on it? Is it still crisp and malleable, or is it trying to crack when you fold it? The standing rigging itself is a little bit more difficult to really test properly without a dye test and sort of a rigging surveyor, but there are a few telltales that you can look for before you pay those people. Of course, any strands of the cable rigging that are sticking out or sort of frayed away, any signs that the cable's been sort of twisted or bent. More in depth, We want to look for rust or corrosion and metal cracking, and particularly where the cable meets the swage fitting, sort of at the deck of the boat. This is where water tends to pool up over the years, and this is usually the first place you'll see it starting to fail. Lastly, the engine. If you don't know much about diesels, there are a few things that you can do without knowing much. First, do we know what the engine hours are? Typically, a well cared for diesel is good for about 6,000 hours before it needs a full refresh or to be rebuilt or just flat out replaced. Things to look for on that diesel are overall condition. Is it filthy? Is there oil or transmission fluid pooled up on the bilge floor underneath it? Does it look like it's got 6,000 hours on it? Pull the dipstick and check the oil. Has that oil been changed recently? Does it smell like oil? Or does it smell like something else? Is it gritty or slimy? Diesels also don't use a lot of electronics to run, but they do have wiring connections. So look at all the wiring for rust or oxidization, particularly on the connections at the end, and see if any wires look like they've been burned. When the engine gets started, it'll probably be the broker or the owner doing it. Make sure you stand at the back of the boat near the exhaust and watch the exhaust. Is there a big sooty cloud when it turns over? Let it come up to operating temperature too, and see if it stops heating up at about the halfway point on the gauge, as it should, and it should just stay there. Or does it keep climbing toward the point of overheating? The other things to look for once it's warm are, is there a lot of gray or white smoke or even white steam coming out of the exhaust? That'd be a sign of overheating. And once the engine's hot, does it sort of simmer down and idle smoothly and then shift in and out of gear properly without anything weird happening? This is just part one for the How to Buy a Sailboat series. I'm going to break it into 2 episodes because it's running a little bit long and I'll be on vacation next week. So I'm going to make part 2 right now, right away, but I'm going to upload it in a few days. I also get a lot of people asking for sort of one-on-one help with the buying process. So I decided to dedicate a page on ladyksailingcom where you can go and book an hour of my time for a call, FaceTime, Zoom, Discord, whatever you like. We can talk. And if you need me, just head on over to ladyksailingcom/consults. And speaking of Discord, there is a great Lady K Sailing community shaping up over there. We talk about boats and buying boats and different problems with boats. We get on video and have some drinks sometimes too. I'll leave a link in the description below for the Discord server. The links expire every week, so if you're watching this a week late, it probably won't work. Look for a newer episode. Until then, keep the heavy side down, but not too far down, because that means you're sinking. Bye, guys.